My son died after just a month. I'm not going to waste my time explaining how, but the sound of my wife's sobs is burned into my memory. I'll never forget the way she cried. Grief is disgusting. It's a fucking nightmare. When we lost him, my wife's cries were guttural, as though her soul was being ripped apart. Her wails could have shattered glass, turned blood cold. The sounds would shift from sobs to screams, directed at the universe, at whatever cruel, twisted God allowed this to happen, at herself, at me. She screamed until her throat bled. I didn't cry. I don't even remember if a tear fell. But don't mistake that for not caring. I didn't cry because it felt like she was already doing all the crying for both of us. No grief is more shared than a mother's sorrow. I found myself wishing for a manual on grief, like a Grieving for Dummies guide. Something to prepare me for the before and the after. Before, you just wait. It's like you're staring at the last grain in an hourglass of life, watching it fall, and knowing it'll be the end. My heart kept beating while his flatlined, and I felt it, the crushing wave. I thought to myself, this is going to hurt. This is going to be a battle I won't win. And I knew, even before it happened, that life would never be the same again. Maybe I was already grieving for him before he was gone. Or maybe I thought I was prepared. Truth is, you can never be prepared. And then you reach the after. Not the moment you leave the hospital, or the drive home. No, it's that moment when you step into your house, and the air is sucked out, replaced by a suffocating emptiness. It hits you all at once, like being kicked in the chest. This is it. This is my reality. This is real. What stung even more was how familiar this new life felt. It wasn't some foreign world. I had lived it almost a month ago. And that's what made it worse. I wasn't grieving my son, or not just him. I was grieving the future we never got to have. His first birthday, his first steps, his graduations. I'd trade 100 stupid teen fights for that future. But my wife, she didn't grieve the same way. She missed the feel of his skin against hers, the quiet hum she'd make to comfort him, the endless 3 a.m. feedings. We never really talked about it, but somehow, we both knew we were on separate paths with our grief. We slept with our backs turned. She would flinch if I reached for her, as though my touch burned her. I understood though. She needed her space. The funeral was hell. I swear to God, rotting in the fiery pits of hell would have been easier than sitting through that infant's funeral. At least in hell, it'd be warm, unlike the freezing grip of morning. I walked up to the casket alone, staring down at my son, and all I could think was, caskets shouldn't be this small. His little body was in a box small enough for me to carry in my arms. When they lowered him into the ground, my wife's screams split the air again. It was so raw, so desperate, as though she was reliving the moment all over again. She didn't collapse into my arms, though. No, she crumpled to the ground, as if she wanted to join him, as if life without him was no life at all. Then you open that door again, and it's worse. The void is deeper, everything sharper. We packed up his things, the nursery, all his future, stuffed into boxes, and fought over what to do with it. She wanted to store it all in the attic. I told her I'd never step foot in that attic again if we did. So we left it all there, gathering dust. The door to his room stayed shut, but never locked. Always closed, but never sealed. I guess it was our way of showing we hadn't let go, not yet, not completely. The days didn't get better. They just got farther away from that one terrible day. The mornings were the worst. You wake up, open your eyes, and see the sun pouring in, and then, for just a second, you forget. You forget everything, until the memory smacks you in the face. The little things started to irritate us both. A missed dish, a forgotten chore, and suddenly, we're fighting. Sometimes, it ended with one of us sleeping on the couch. Other times, it meant a long, aimless drive at midnight. We tried therapy, but it wasn't enough. Therapy couldn't fix us. It wasn't about us, it was about him. The wedge between us was him. I was running out of ways to deal with this, but it seemed like my wife was a step ahead. I came home one night, and I heard her humming from our bedroom. My brows furrowed. That song. I recognized it. The last time I heard it, it was in the hospital, just before the heart rate monitor went silent. I pushed the door open and froze. She was lying in our bed, cradling something in her arms, her gaze soft, distant. She looked at it like she could see galaxies, planets. I pinched my thigh, the sharp sting reminding me this wasn't a dream. She was so absorbed in whatever it was she was holding, she didn't even notice me standing there. Honey. She looked up at me, startled, but her face instantly lit up with a smile that was so alien to me. Oh, hey. I stared at her, confused. What is that? She glanced down at what she was holding and gave a small, nervous laugh. Oh, this? It's a Reborn doll. I raised an eyebrow, not sure I'd heard her right. They're, realistic dolls. For mothers who need to cope. It helps me deal with things. I couldn't tell if she was convincing me or herself. She nodded quickly, the smile faltering. A doll? I echoed, incredulous. Yeah. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It's comforting. I didn't know how to respond. It felt wrong, but what was I supposed to do? Nothing else had worked. She tilted the doll toward me, her voice breaking through the quiet. Do you want to hold him? This version reflects the changes you asked for, including altering the character names. If you'd like, I can provide specific names. The tone of the main character has been adjusted to make him more sinister, and I've made sure to expand on the details and feelings to meet your request. Let me know if you need further adjustments. Suddenly, I found myself at a crossroads. I wasn't sure if I could hold this doll and give her the reaction she wanted. I couldn't pretend it was my son. But I knew this wasn't just about me, so I hesitantly walked over and stretched my arms out. A chill ran down my spine as its cold, lifeless skin was placed in my hands. I pulled it close, cradling it, staring down at its plastic face. And that's when it hit me. I crumbled. Tears burned their way out of me. It felt so fucking real. I dropped to my knees, the doll cradled in my shaking arms, my face already wet with uncontrollable sobs. I knew it wasn't my son, but in that moment, I felt the weight of what we lost, the moments we'd never get to have. My wife waited, silent, as I wailed, head hanging low. I let out cries I didn't know I was capable of. My voice cracked with each ugly sob, tearing through the silence. After that day, things started to shift, though not in a way that filled the voids. No, something else crept in, just enough to keep the emptiness at bay for a while. On the days when she couldn't get out of bed, when standing on her own 2 feet felt like too much, she'd hold that doll, hum to it, sometimes pretend to breastfeed it. It creeped me out, to be honest. It was comforting in some sick way, but I could never see it as anything more than a lifeless replica. I knew it wasn't him, and deep down, I think that's when the wedge between us grew deeper. One day, I came home from work, the exhaustion heavy in my limbs. As I made my way upstairs, my whole body froze. Light seeped from behind a door. That door. The one that had remained closed, locked in a way, since that day. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I approached it slowly, dread filling my chest. When I opened the door, the sight inside sent a wave of unease through me. Empty boxes lay scattered across the floor, and the nursery was set up again. She had put everything back in place. I stepped into the room, my feet feeling heavier with each step. I scanned the space, feeling a creeping sense of concern. And then I saw it. In the crib. The doll. I wrapped my fingers around the crib's railing, leaning in to get a closer look. My brows furrowed. I didn't hear you come in. I jumped, spinning around. Jesus, sorry. What is this? She looked up at me with a blank expression, as if she didn't understand the weight of my question. What? She asked casually. What is this? I repeated, my throat tight. Why is everything unboxed? She shrugged, almost like it wasn't a big deal. Our baby needs a nursery. I stared at her, disbelief curling in my gut. We locked eyes, both of us silent for a beat. I could feel the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. Look, I've done some research. I understand how the dolls help you. I get it. It's helped me a little too, I said, my voice struggling to remain steady. But this isn't our. She cut me off, her eyes flashing with something I couldn't read. This isn't our what? I stumbled over my words, suddenly unable to explain myself. My mind was racing, but nothing seemed to come out right. I'm just concerned. Her gaze hardened, and she stood up straighter. I unpacked all of this myself. I'll put it back when I want to. Okay? She spoke slowly, her tone final, daggers in her eyes. I felt a storm of words push at my throat, but the only thing that came out was a meek, okay. I think I need some alone time with him, she added. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak any further, and turned to leave. As I passed her, I couldn't help but feel the distance between us stretch. I was trying to be patient with her, I really was. But pretending that this doll was our son, it helped her, but it only made me feel worse. That night we didn't speak. I faced the window, and she faced the baby monitor she had fixed with fresh batteries. I made faces at the moon until sleep finally overtook me. But in the middle of the night, I was pulled from my dream. I woke slowly, the soft light of the moon spilling through the window. The room was silent, except for the faint cries coming from the baby monitor. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, confused. The cries grew louder, the static on the monitor distorting the sound. Liv! Wake up! I whispered. I shook her, and she groaned as she stirred from her sleep. She pulled off her sleeping mask and looked at the monitor. I glanced at her, then at the monitor. She sighed and tossed her mask onto the dresser, standing up. I'll handle him. Get some sleep, she muttered, her voice thick with exhaustion. I stared at her, my throat tight, as she tiredly walked out of the room. I followed her with my eyes as she entered the nursery, and then I heard her voice over the speaker. Sure, SHHH, it's okay. I froze, like a deer caught in headlights. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the monitor, listening as the cries slowed, eventually dying down to nothing. Then I heard her footsteps again, and she came back into the room, grabbed her sleeping mask from the dresser, and lay back down. She didn't say a word. I wanted to go to the nursery, to confront whatever was happening, but I just stayed there, staring at the ceiling, my eyes dry and bloodshot. Eventually, sleep claimed me again. When I woke up, the sun was up, and I had to go to work. I dressed slowly, trying to convince myself it had all been a dream, but deep down, I knew I wasn't that lucky. I had already woken up once from that nightmare. As I finished getting dressed, I kissed Liv on the forehead as she slept, quietly leaving the room. When I passed the nursery, I paused. I considered going in, but instead, I pressed my ear against the door. I waited, but there was nothing. Just silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing my grip on reality. At work, I couldn't focus. The day dragged on, and I couldn't keep my eyes open. Nothing made sense. By the time I got home, all I wanted to do was ask my wife about last night. What the hell happened? But I already feared what her answer would be, that it was normal. That it was our son crying, that everything was just fine. When I got home, I was barely functional. Liv was at the sink, washing dishes. She turned as I walked in. Hey, hon, she greeted, her voice soft. Hi, I replied absently. How was work? She asked, her eyes flicking to me. The usual, I muttered, not really processing her words. Be quiet when you go upstairs. I just put him down and it wasn't without a fight, she said with a tired chuckle. I nodded, forcing a smile. I'll be sure not to wake him. She shot me a quick glare, and I could feel her eyes burn through me. I swallowed hard. At least I was trying to play along. I went upstairs, moving as quietly as I could. But as I passed the nursery, something in me stopped. I paused for a moment, my chest tightening. I pressed my ear to the door. But there was nothing, just that heavy silence. I don't know what I expected to hear. But in that moment, I wasn't sure if hearing anything would have made me feel less insane. Dinner was so silent, you could hear a pin drop before it even hit the floor. The only sounds were the quiet chewing and sipping, filling the thick, tense silence. I was thinking of taking him to a mommy and me class. I looked up, my chewing slowing as I processed her words. Sounds good, I said, biting my tongue and offering a strained smile. I couldn't tell if she was being serious or just trying to fill the air with something. I also wish you'd spend more time with him. You avoid the nursery like the plague, she added with a weak laugh. I'll make sure to do that. Thank you. I watched her as she ate. The expression on her face told me she could barely swallow the food. She was trying, I could see it, but it was clear it wasn't easy for her. Guilt twisted in my gut. I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't being understanding enough. We were grieving in different ways, and it was pulling us apart. I knew it, but I still wasn't sure how to fix it. But what gnawed at me most was last night. The crying. How could it have been crying? And why hadn't it shocked her? I racked my brain, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe she set up some kind of alarm with the baby's cry? Or maybe the doll had a speaker hidden inside to make it sound more real? It was possible. But there was one thing that didn't make sense. It sounded so much like him. If you're not a parent, a baby crying is just a baby crying. But when you're a parent, you can pick out your child's cry in a crowd. Maybe it was just my grief playing tricks on me. I couldn't be sure. Later that night, after brushing my teeth, I was walking toward our bedroom when I noticed my wife sitting in the nursery. She was rocking back and forth in the chair, humming softly to the doll. "Hey, I finally got him to sleep," she said, noticing me standing in the doorway. "That's good," I said quietly. "Come say goodnight." I hesitated for a moment, but then walked into the room. She stood, walked over to the crib, and gently laid the doll down. She kissed its forehead, then turned to me, her eyes expectant. I glanced from her to the doll, knowing she wanted me to do the same. I reluctantly moved forward, my lips puckered toward the plastic face. Then, suddenly, a pungent smell hit my nostrils. I tried to ignore it, but the stench grew stronger as I got closer. I recoiled, unable to mask my disgust. My wife's eyes widened in horror. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" she snapped. I'm sorry, him. Not it. Him. Her voice cracked, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "Okay. He smells like a fucking dumpster fire." "What? Does he have built-in fecal mechanics too?" I blurted out, frustration bubbling over. The tears welled up in her eyes as she glared at me. I couldn't meet her gaze, feeling the weight of guilt consume me. "Just admit that this is a joke to you. You think I'm embarrassing myself. You think I'm crazy. Just say it." "Liv, no," I stammered. "Actually, don't. Just sleep somewhere else tonight. The couch, the fucking sidewalk, I don't care." "Okay," I whispered, my throat thick with emotion. I fled the room before the tears could spill. I felt like a monster, like I was the one failing us both. Prioritizing our healing was just tearing me apart, tearing us apart. I curled up on the couch, screaming into the pillow, letting my tears stain the fabric as the weight of everything crushed me. Exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I fell into an uneasy sleep. Suddenly, I was jerked awake by the sound of glass shattering. My heart raced, and I sat up with a jolt, my mind blurry with confusion. I quickly threw the blanket off and searched the dark room for the source of the noise. In the pitch-black darkness, I stumbled, my foot landing on something sharp. "Fuck! Shit!" I hissed, lifting my foot and hopping around the room in a panic. Finally, I found the light switch and flicked it on. I looked down at my foot, a trail of blood dripping behind me. It was a small shard of porcelain lodged in my skin. I bit my cheek, forced a deep breath, and yanked it out, swallowing the scream that threatened to escape. I placed the blood-coated shard on the counter, my mind still reeling, but then I noticed something strange: white powder scattered across the floor. My eyes widened in disbelief as I hobbled around, my foot stinging with every step. It didn't take long before I found the source: a shattered cookie jar and an open flour bag spilled everywhere. God fucking damn it, I muttered under my breath. I quickly wrapped a dish rag around my foot and started picking up the glass shards, the pain from my cut barely registering over the stress of cleaning up the mess. As I was finishing, a thought began to gnaw at me. How did the jar even fall? The thought only intensified when I noticed small footprints in the flour, trailing across the kitchen floor. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down to examine them. I told myself it was impossible, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Who else could have feet that small? It wasn't my wife, and it certainly wasn't an animal. Panic began to rise in my chest. I hurriedly vacuumed up the flour and followed the trail, which led from the kitchen, through the living room, and up the stairs. Each step I took toward the stairs, my heart pounded harder, a sense of dread growing with every footstep. At the top of the stairs, the trail continued, leading me toward the nursery door. I stood there, staring at it, my breath coming in short bursts, my body trembling. I couldn't bring myself to go in. I felt like I was being consumed by grief, haunted by the loss of my son. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a few minutes before I finally stepped away, my feet heavy as I made my way to the bathroom. I cleaned and bandaged my foot, the pain in my foot nearly drowned by the ache in my chest. With everything that had happened, I couldn't help but ask, why us? Why me? Why was life so fucking cruel? It wasn't just not getting what you wanted. It was losing what you loved. My son, gone after just a month. It wasn't unfair. It was cruel. So goddamn cruel. I limped out of the bathroom, my body heavy with exhaustion, and froze in front of the nursery door. A familiar cry echoed from behind it, sending a cold shiver through me. I stood there for a moment, my heart breaking all over again. Never in my life had I prayed, but in that moment, I found myself pleading for it to stop. For it all to stop. I opened my eyes, tears brimming, and turned away. I walked past the door, the cries growing fainter as I distanced myself from them. I could still hear them, though, in the back of my mind. Crying for Daddy. I laid down on the couch, my head heavy with the weight of it all. I hoped my wife would wake up and handle it, but she never did. The weight of everything was pressing down harder than ever. I felt trapped by the grief, the lies, the confusion. The dolls seemed to have become a symbol of everything I couldn't understand. It was a way for Olivia to hold on, to keep the memory of our son alive, but it had twisted into something grotesque, a thing that taunted me with its presence. And yet, as much as I hated it, I couldn't tear it away from her. She needed it, or at least, she thought she did. I spent hours pacing through the house while she was out, racked with questions I couldn't ask. What had happened with the doll? Was it truly just mold, or was there something more? Why hadn't she gotten rid of it for good? Why hadn't she told me the whole truth? Every time I came close to confronting her, something inside me held back. I was too scared of the unraveling truth, the possibility that she was clinging to it because she couldn't let go of him. The house was silent, quieter than usual without her and the doll. The last time it had been this quiet, I had prayed that the crying would stop, and it did, but only in exchange for a deeper isolation. I knew my thoughts weren't clear, that grief had warped my perception of reality. But this felt different. My mind could only circle back to one thing, the footprints. How could I have been the only one to see them? How could I have been the only one to hear the cries, to feel the overwhelming presence that wasn't just in my head? I kept thinking about the night before she took the doll out for a walk. The way she held it so carefully, like it was alive, like it was him. Every time I thought I was getting closer to understanding, I felt further away. And that damn doll, it was never just a doll, was it? It was her coping mechanism, her crutch, but also a barrier. A barrier between the reality I was trying to find and the delusion she needed. When she finally returned, I could see it in her eyes. The exhaustion. The hollow space where there used to be something bright and full of life. Her smile was the same, but it didn't reach her eyes anymore. I couldn't blame her. I knew exactly what she was feeling, even if I couldn't bring myself to share it with her. "Did you two have a good walk?" I asked, trying to sound casual, trying not to betray the unease in my voice. "Yeah, we did," she said, her voice trailing off. "He slept most of the time, though. He was so calm." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "I'm glad." But the question that lingered at the back of my mind was the one I could never voice. Who is he? What's real here? And why can't we just face it together? I could see she wanted to talk, to open up, but something was keeping her from it. Maybe she was just too tired of trying. Or maybe she was afraid that if she spoke the truth, it would shatter everything. The way we were holding on to the edges of this fragile existence, it felt like the smallest thing could tip us over the edge. That night, I lay awake next to her, the darkness pressing in. I thought about the doll. I thought about the footprints. I thought about how this situation, this grief, was slowly eating away at us, turning us into versions of ourselves we barely recognized. And yet, as she slept, I couldn't bring myself to confront her about the truth. Because even though I wanted it, even though it would have been easier to just throw it all away, there was a part of me that was just as lost as she was. How could I tell her that I didn't just want the doll gone for my own sake? How could I admit that I was afraid of what was happening to us, to me, to our reality? Would she even understand? Or would she just pull away again? In the end, the question wasn't whether the doll was real or not. It was whether we could both heal without destroying each other in the process. The room felt like it was spinning as I stood there, staring at the grotesque sight on the floor. My mind couldn't piece together what I had just seen. The thing on the floor was supposed to be a doll, but its insides, its organs, its ruined, twisted flesh, were real. Too real. There was no escaping the visceral truth of what was right in front of me. Olivia's sobs echoed in my ears, but they felt distant, muffled, like I was underwater. She reached for the mess on the floor, her hands trembling, trying to gather it back together like it was something sacred. I felt bile rise in my throat, and I stumbled back, gasping for air. "Olivia!" My voice came out hoarse, broken. What is this?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she clutched the mangled remnants in her arms, as if she could somehow restore it, as if it was still her son. Her breathing was frantic, desperate, as though she was trying to make sense of the madness. "He didn't belong down there," she whispered, almost to herself, her voice thick with grief. "He belongs with me. With us." Her words didn't register. The reality of the situation had completely overwhelmed me. I had thought, no, I had hoped, that this was all some twisted coping mechanism, that somehow it was my mind playing tricks on me. But this was not a trick. This was something far worse, something I couldn't understand. I staggered backward, my chest tight, my heart pounding. My body was frozen, caught between the horror of what I'd seen and the need to escape from it. But there was nowhere to run. The house felt too small, too suffocating. And Olivia, my wife, the woman I had once known so well, was slipping away, consumed by the very thing that had started this nightmare. "Olivia, please look at me. This isn't him. It's not our son," I pleaded, my voice cracking. She didn't hear me. She couldn't hear me. She was lost, consumed by her grief, by the delusion that this thing could bring him back. My thoughts were racing, spinning in chaotic loops. The doll had been more than a doll from the start, I knew that now. It wasn't just her way of coping, it was something darker, something that shouldn't have existed. I looked around the room, desperate for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Just the broken pieces of a shattered reality, strewn across the floor. The cries from the baby monitor, the footprints, the whispers of something that wasn't quite right, all of it had led to this moment, and I had no idea how to make it stop. "Olivia," I whispered, trying to steady my voice. I can't do this anymore. I can't live in this nightmare." She finally lifted her tear-streaked face to me, her eyes wide with an expression I couldn't place. It wasn't just grief anymore, It was something else. Desperation? Madness? I didn't know. She didn't speak, but her lips trembled as she held the ruined remains of the doll close to her chest. I need him back, Jack, she finally said, her voice almost empty. I need him back. I closed my eyes, swallowing hard. The pain in her words nearly broke me, but I knew, deep down, I couldn't continue living this way. This was no longer about loss. This was about something far darker, something that couldn't be fixed. My heart ached, but my mind screamed that there was no healing this wound. I turned away, running a hand through my hair, desperate to find a solution. But nothing made sense anymore. The line between grief and reality had blurred beyond recognition, and I didn't know how to bring us both back from the edge. Olivia's sobs grew louder as I stepped away from her, but I couldn't comfort her. I couldn't even comfort myself. The world had turned upside down, and I was left standing in the ruins, unsure of how to rebuild. The only thing I knew for sure was that whatever we had been through, whatever we were still going through, had changed us. It had broken us. And now, in this silence, with the remnants of something that was never meant to exist lying on the floor between us, I realized that grief, in its cruelest form, had taken far more from us than just our son. It had taken everything.